The United States debt ceiling has been raised 42 times since 1981. But with the risk of the debt ceiling not being raised, the United States could go into default. A default means the United States may not be able to meet its financial obligations, like, for example, paying government employees or paying Social Security benefits on time. This would surely take the stock market down, affect the US credit score, and the global power status it currently holds. But why should you care about the default? How does the debt ceiling work, and how could it impact you? Now, as of the making of this video, the US has never defaulted on its debt. It's generally considered to be one of the safest investments in the world. The power to tax and the power to print its own currency gives the US government tools to avoid default at most circumstances. So how does all this money work for the United States government? Well, just like our own personal finance, the United States makes money and they spend money. Now, the US Treasury is responsible for making all of this happen, although it's important to note that the US Treasury does not make decisions on raising the debt limit or what to spend its money on. It simply just helps bring in the money and spend the money. Let's look at the ways the US spends money to better understand the debt limit. Typically, there's two major buckets of spending, including government payroll and programs. Now, programs are very broad, but they include things such as Social Security, Medicare, special interest, and so many more programs. Now, how the government makes their money is basically through taxes. This can be payroll tax, sales tax, corporate tax, and more. Now, the issue is taxes alone are not covering all of the government spending. So, the government makes up for this by taking on debt. How they take on the debt is by selling bonds, which are one of the most safest investments backed by the Tier 1 asset, while at times printing cash as a secondary option. But there are times where taxes and debt don't cover the spending. So then the simple answer is, the government must either raise income through taxes, slow down or reduce government spending, or raise the debt limit. I mean, that sounds simple, right? Well, it could be simple, but it's not always that easy because of, well, politics. Remember how we said the US Treasury only handles the income and the spending of the funds? Well, the decision on how we spend and how we raise taxes actually lands on both the president and Congress. But it gets more complicated. See, the president can submit a budget that includes various ways to raise income through taxes, various plans, new programs for spending, etc. But Congress has to approve it. And if Congress doesn't approve it, including the decisions of raising the debt ceiling to take on more spending, things get a little bit scary and a little bit mucky. Here's the best way to look at it from a personal finance perspective. Let's say you have your income. You make money every month. And on the other side, you have your expenses. Now, your expenses could include everything from going out to eat at a restaurant, to your electric bill, to rent or mortgage, your car loans, student loans, all of that. Now, if you're spending more than you're making every month, well, you're either going to have to stop spending so much or take on debt to fund your lifestyle. Let's say for the easiness of today's story that you can only take out credit cards to fund your lifestyle and make up for your lack of income. But your significant other, just like Congress, is the only person who can allow you to take on more credit cards to fund your lifestyle. Now, if your significant other disagrees with you, well, then you either need to stop spending so much, or if you're in too much debt, you may have to default on your credit cards. And you know what that means. Your credit score might drop, you may have default on your loans, and you might even have to declare bankruptcy. Now, that in its most basic form is what's going on every time you hear about the debt ceiling needing to be raised in the US federal government. So, how many times has the debt ceiling raised since the 1980s? Well, let's start with the most recent. President Donald Trump raised the debt ceiling 2 times. The debt level at the time Trump was sworn into office was $19.9 trillion and grew to more than $27 trillion by the time he left office. Of course, COVID was a primary driver of the increase at that time. President Bill Clinton raised the debt ceiling 4 times. Now, it was only raised by a modest 44%, going from $4.1 trillion when Clinton was sworn into office to $5.95 trillion when he left office. Hey, fun fact, by the way, did you know that during Bill Clinton's era, we were in a surplus? So if you hop over to usdebtclock.org, you can actually look at the latest national debt compared to the tax revenue of the US government. Now, looking at US federal spending versus tax revenue, you can see right now we're spending more than we are taking in. But if we go back to the year 2000, when Bill Clinton was still in office, take a look at that. You can see the federal spending was actually less than revenue, creating a surplus. So, hats off to you, President Bill Clinton. Now let's move on. President George W. Bush raised the debt ceiling 7 times during his tenure, Starting at $5.95 trillion when he took office, the debt limit jumped to $11.315 trillion by the time he left. President Barack Obama also raised the debt ceiling 7 times, heading from $11.3 trillion to $18.1 trillion. Now you might ask, well, which president since the 80s raised the debt ceiling the most? Well, that award would go to President Ronald Reagan. A total of 18 times during his presidency, the debt ceiling was raised. Now, like all presidents, Reagan fought his own battles at the time, but his undying belief was that the ability of the U.S. to pay its bills and remain a stable democracy were the pillars of the country's standing in the world. So during his tenure, the debt went from $935 billion to $2.8 trillion. So with all this talk of the debt ceiling, what happens if the United States actually defaults? Well, beyond not being able to make its payments to Social Security and its other obligations, the economy would be at massive risk. Jobs would likely be lost, interest rates on credit cards and mortgages would skyrocket more than they already have, the stock market would drop, some say, up to 45% or more, and the credit rating, which has always been maintained at a AA or AAA status for the United States, would likely downgrade, which is not favorable for any side of the aisle, Republican or Democrat. So in order to not default, why don't we just not have a debt limit like almost any other country? Or set the debt limit so high that it would never be a threat to the economy? Well, here's the issue. Because after all, if Congress and the president really wanted to take on debt, they would just need to restructure taxes or reduce spending. And because of some of the politics, where you see negotiations on raising the debt limit typically go all the way until the absolute last moment before it could get absolutely severe. So here's what I want to hear from you. Comment down below with your thoughts on the US debt limit. And if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe and turn on the bell for more notifications. Make sure you check out this video next, and we'll see you on the next video.